Trudy, let's try to do Bette Davis. Let's see. Come on. Let's see if we can do it. Let's see if we can do it on the fly. Come on. Come on, here you go. Come on. Welcome back to Real Takes, where we are all movie love all the time. I want to say again tonight that I stand with the people of Ukraine, and this week I'd just like to remind everyone that Doctors Without Borders is a great organization bringing medical relief to people in war-torn areas all over the world, but right now in Ukraine in particular. So that's a great organization to support in this time. And tonight we are shining all the movie love on Bette Davis, whose birthday is this week. Bette Davis was an Aries. She's like the fire sign of all fire signs. She's lit from within. She's burning with passion and vulnerability that she brought to the screen in her roles. I love Bette Davis films. I love her as an actress, and I'm really excited to celebrate her. It's just hard to contain Bette Davis in one episode. There's so much to say, but she arrived in Hollywood right after Talking Pictures became the ubiquitous format in 1930, and she signed a contract with Universal, but then switched to Warner Brothers a year or two later. And for those of you who don't know, the way it worked in the 30s, 40s, and 50s into the 60s is that if you were an actor going to Hollywood, what you wanted to do was get a contract with a studio, and then you were on salary. You had a weekly salary, and you did whatever they told you to do. You changed your name, you did the makeover, you were in whatever pictures they told you to be in. You weren't in pictures they didn't want you to be in. And, you hoped that through getting the right roles and connecting with the right people, you would sort of rise out of having supporting roles and become a star. So Bette Davis signed this contract, and she was doing her job. And also in those days, studios churned out far more movies than they do today. So I think in 1932, Bette Davis was in 9 films, and most of them were terrible. And a few of them were better, and we're going to get to that in a minute. But she started to get really frustrated at Warner Brothers because she knew she wasn't getting the scripts or working with the directors that would allow her to do what she knew she could do. And so, because she was Bette Davis, she made a really bold move. And in 1936, she signed a contract. She broke her contract. She signed a contract with a London production company to make 2 films, basically, breaching her contract with Warner Brothers, and left the country. And she thought what would happen is that they wouldn't care and they would just settle out of court with her, but they sued her. I'm sure partially because they didn't want other actors thinking they could just do this whenever they wanted to. And she lost in court, but because she's Bette Davis, she won in the end. She won the respect of Jack Warner, of Warner Brothers, and she started getting better scripts and better directors. And from then on, she made a series of films where she just kind of like knocked it out of the park one after another. The Letter, Jezebel, Now, Voyager, Dark Victory. There's something she made 3 with William Wyler in a row: The Letter, Jezebel, and The Little Foxes. Whew, got it. The Little Foxes. So she's got these meatier, deeper, much more complicated, much richer roles that she could really sink into. And she started working with, better, bigger directors who, had a point of view and really had something to say. And apparently she went head to head with them a lot. And she has said, that she was tempestuous and argumentative and stubborn and, passionate. But she's been very clear, actually, when people accuse her of being a diva or difficult, she has been very clear she was never unprofessional. She was always really proud of being a professional, and she was really proud of being an actress. And the thing she valued most was a really good script. And later in her career, she did a lot of TV, and there are clips of her on Johnny Carson saying there are really good scripts happening on television. So she really loved a good script, a good role. She once said, actors don't really want a lot of money and fame. They want a really good part, and they want someone to say, "Thank you, you did a good job." Almost makes me cry thinking about Bette Davis saying that. So I thought I'd talk about two movies tonight, one from her early career, and then the ultimate Bette Davis film of all Bette Davis films, All About Eve, but we'll get to that in a minute. So she's in Hollywood. It's the early to mid 30s. She's cranking out these films, many of which are bad. She has particular disdain for a film called The Parachute Jumper, which I have not seen. But interspersed in there are some interesting movies. First of all, she made a string of movies with Michael Curtiz, who would go on to make Casablanca, Mildred Pierce, White Christmas. I mean, he went on to be a really big director, and her second film with him is a little film. It's barely an hour long, or just a little over an hour long, called Cabin in the Cotton. It's a political film about farm workers being exploited by landowners in the South, and she plays the daughter of the landowners and gets to say great lines like, "I'd kiss you, but I just washed my hair." So, and then she made a few more movies with him, I believe. 20,000 Years in Sing Sing was Michael Curtiz. Kid Galahad was Michael Curtiz with Humphrey Bogart. But the film I want to talk about that I really, really love is called The Petrified Forest, which came out in 1936 and starred Leslie Howard, Bette Davis, and Humphrey Bogart in his first film role. So, first interesting thing about this movie is that the lead star of this film was not Bette Davis or Humphrey Bogart, who are much more known now. It was Leslie Howard, who was a huge star at the time. And in fact, it was Leslie Howard who got Humphrey Bogart the job because... Okay, I'm going to be jumping in a bunch here because I was working without notes and have to clean up some messes. So Leslie Howard was the biggest star in that moment, and he and Bette Davis would do a few movies together, but he had been in the play, The Petrified Forest. This was a play on Broadway, and Humphrey Bogart had been in the play, and Leslie Howard was so moved by his performance on stage that he fought for him to be in the movie. And it wasn't his first movie. He'd done a handful of movies, but he didn't have a studio contract. And this was the film that got him a studio contract. So it was a really important movie for him. And I don't even know if some of the other movies he'd been in survive, much less if we'd want to watch them. So that is how Humphrey Bogart came to star in this movie, thanks to Leslie Howard. And the play is really an allegory. It's set in the desert of Arizona, and we're in the middle of nowhere, and Bette Davis's father owns and operates a little gas station diner type place, a way stop on a dirt road. And Bette Davis's mother is French. Her parents got together during the World War II, and her mother went back to France. She couldn't cut it in the deserts of the Southwest. And Bette Davis has this big case of wanderlust, and she plays sort of like the youthful dreamer who wants a bigger life. Her father plays the sort of the patriot, the unthinking patriot, who's, by the way, absent for most of the film, which is an interesting message. Leslie Howard plays the kind of disillusioned, aging thinker. There's a young, brawny guy in the film, and then there's the gangster. And, it's very clearly a play. Like, clearly in the play, the whole thing just happened inside the diner. I think Alfred Green, the director, does a pretty good job of kind of giving it some motion and movement and variety for film. But the script is so strong that it's okay that it was a play. And it's kind of what happens when the gangster holds this group of people hostage in the diner. And I just love it. And by the way, loving this film completely outs me as a hopeless romantic, and I'm fine with that. There are a couple of other interesting things about it. First of all, for its time, it had 2 Black characters. Neither of them are main characters, but they both have names. They interact with each other, and one of them, has some real agency. He's a member of Humphrey Bogart's gang. The other one is the chauffeur of a rich man, and there's some interaction with them and some commentary about, their place in the world. So they're not main characters. It's not the main thing. But I mean, if you watch classic film, you'll see there are a lot of, there are thousands of films with no Black characters at all. And then there are lots of films with a Black character who comes in and puts down the bags and leaves. And that's it. So that's an interesting factor. There's also, unfortunately, as so many classic films have, a little primer in sexual harassment. So there's a young, brawny guy who's after Bette Davis at the top of the film, and he explains to her that attraction is like radio waves, and if he's feeling the radio waves, that means she's sending them whether she knows it or not. I was like, oh, wow, look, there it is. The justification for sexual harassment. So, classic film comes with all kinds of pitfalls, but I still love this film and I love the script, but I love seeing Bette Davis in her youth in this kind of idealistic dreaming role, because the roles she became famous for were much more complicated, and sometimes she's like the anti-heroine, which I love too, but like to see her as this like wild dreamer who knows she's meant for more than what she's living with, it's just really, really fun. So I highly recommend The Petrified Forest. But one of the ways that Bette Davis, got herself out of just being stereotyped as the girlfriend all the time, which is not what happens in The Petrified Forest, but happened in a lot of these movies, aside from breaching her contract, was she was in a movie called Of Human Bondage, where she plays a woman who takes advantage of a man for the whole movie. And in fact, Leslie Howard. But she plays a really unlikable character. And at the end of the film, her character's sick. And, the makeup people for the film wanted to make her up in that sort of Hollywood star sick way. And she was like, no. And she went to a doctor and said, what would I look like? And then she did her own makeup and she looks awful. And the studio was horrified. They were like, no one's ever going to want to see this ever again. It was just so against the aesthetic of what Hollywood movies were then, but she really fought for it, and people went nuts for the movie because they hadn't seen anything like it. They hadn't seen an actor sort of bearing themselves that way, and it opened a door for her to start playing these unlikable, difficult, complicated, darker characters, which was a huge part of how she made her mark in these other films that lead us to the ultimate Bette Davis film, All About Eve. So All About Eve was written and directed by Joseph Mankiewicz, who was a big Hollywood writer, director, producer. He also made The Barefoot Contessa. He also made lots of movies that I'm like going blank on right now, and I'm riding, look, ma, no hands, I don't have my notebook. So I'm like going blank on right now, and I'm riding, look, ma, no hands, I don't have my notebooks. Take notes, Anne. Okay, so Joseph Mankiewicz, I can't believe I blanked on this. He wrote films, screenplays throughout the 30s and into the 40s, and then in the mid 40s he started directing himself. He directed A Letter to Three Wives, which he also wrote. We talked about him when we celebrated Sidney Poitier because he wrote and directed No Way Out, which was Sidney Poitier's first starring role and very important for his career. Great little noir with commentary on racism in America. And then after All About Eve, he went on to make, like I said, The Barefoot Contessa, Suddenly Last Summer, Guys and Dolls, Julius Caesar, and Cleopatra. So big, big, big Hollywood career. And he made All About Eve, and it stars Bette Davis, Gary Merrill, Celeste Holm, Anne Baxter, the great George Sanders, and Marilyn Monroe in a very early small part. Now, apparently Joseph Mankiewicz had been wanting to make a backstage drama about the theater, which is what this is. And he made an incredibly sharp, smart backstage drama about the theater and theater people. And Bette Davis famously plays Margot Channing, a huge star of the stage, who is lovers with her director, who is 8 years her junior. And she's around 40, and she's worried about her age. She's worried about her age in her relationship. She's worried about her age in her career. And then enter Anne Baxter playing the titular Eve, who is a down-on-her-luck fan of Bette Davis's character, who weasels her way into Bette Davis's life. And there's a lot of conflict among this group of friends, played by Bette Davis and Celeste Holm and Gary Merrill, about whether Eve is a good person or not a good person, and from there, what's going to happen. Now, I don't often talk about the big classics like this because there has been so much written about All About Eve, and it's been covered in 100 different ways. But the truth is, all classics are underseen now. So if you haven't seen All About Eve, you have to see All About Eve. It is brilliantly written, perfectly directed, brilliantly acted by everybody. It is a tour de force performance on the part of Bette Davis. There's been a ton written about the backstage, behind the camera of the backstage drama. Apparently, Bette Davis and Celeste Holm, who played best friends, didn't get along at all. Bette Davis and Gary Merrill fell in love and got married after their divorces came through while making this film. So a lot of backstage gossip to go over. And I have huge respect for this film. And I also love George Sanders in it. And George Sanders... Okay, so I totally mangled the George Sanders thing coming back in. George Sanders was a British actor. He was in over 120 films, and sometimes he was a star, sometimes he was a supporting character. I think he's more famous for his supporting work in bigger films. He was in 2 Hitchcock films, Rebecca and Foreign Correspondent. This is definitely his most famous role, but just before we get into this role, if you want to see 2 other great George Sanders performances, he was in the Roberto Rossellini film Journey to Italy with Ingrid Bergman, and he gives a devastating performance in the Jean Renoir film This Land Is Mine, which is about a Nazi-occupied town in southern France during World War II. Great performances. I always love him. He's so engaged and present, and yet a little wary of everything and all of us all the time. And his line delivery is basically flawless all the time. So in this film, he plays the theater critic, Addison DeWitt. And he's one step ahead of everybody the whole movie. And he's, the cheapest way to say it is he's the peanut gallery, but he's the smartest peanut gallery you've ever experienced. And he actually, in a way, is the linchpin of the film, even though he certainly doesn't have as much screen time as the other stars. His narration opens the film. And just a warning, if you don't watch a lot of classic cinema, you know, these movies start slower than we're used to movies starting now. So there's a lot of explanation and character introduction and exposition, and it's really well written. It's super smart. And again, George Saunders' delivery is perfect, but it's not what you're used to now in terms of how stories are introduced on cinema. But he turns the plot in some very key ways and has some brilliant scenes. It's a great character in the history of American cinema. So all praise and love for George Sanders all the time. But what I want to say is that the golden age of Hollywood is really fascinating because there were these incredibly strong, smart, independent women who had huge careers in film. The three biggest names are Bette Davis, Katharine Hepburn, and Barbara Stanwyck. Okay. My channel isn't popular enough yet for the Joan Crawford stans to find me, but I just have to come back in because I'm in danger of being, you know, cyber murdered by Joan Crawford fans right now. Yes, Joan Crawford. Yes, huge, incredible star of the screen. In all those years, I plead, I was working without notes. And then lots of other women too, Deborah Carr, Greer Garson. I mean, so many women were working all the time putting out movies in this era. But I think, you know, Bette Davis, Joan Crawford, Katharine Hepburn, and Barbara Stanwyck had these outsized personalities and were forces of nature, both on the screen and off, and, you know, had big careers making movies for years. So someone was writing those movies for them, someone was directing them, and someone was producing them. We don't have that kind of film happening on a regular basis anymore. They're relegated as chick flicks. They're not budgeted the same way. They're not promoted the same way. And the film industry has not supported over the decades multiple strong, complicated, fascinating women having big movie careers, I would argue. And at the same time, it was still the 40s and the 50s, and these films are kind of entrenched in some regressive ideas about the sexes, right? So there's this crazy contradiction going on in these movies where here we have Bette Davis owning every second she's on the screen, who lived this incredibly independent, powerful life. She took on the head of one of the most powerful studios in Hollywood. And there she is delivering lines like, you know, if you don't wake up in the morning and have a man lying next to you in bed, you're not a woman. And, you know, on the way up, you drop a lot of things you don't realize you're going to need later when you decide to be a woman. And the film is completely committed to the idea that being ambitious is unwomanly. And the biggest challenges in Bette Davis's character's life in this movie are her age, which is still a huge challenge for women in the performing arts, so valid, and a young woman coming up trying to take her place. Now, I'm sure there are plenty of conniving young women trying to weasel their way in places all the time, but considering the dearth of stories about the real challenges powerful women face in trying to have careers, it's a little interesting that that's the story to be told here. So there's just a fascinating contradiction, and you see it in the Katharine Hepburn films too, where they have to kind of ultimately play it safe and land themselves in these very conservative ideas about what a woman's place is, that were widely held beliefs then. So in a way it makes sense that those would be in the movie, but they're so contradictory to the women we are seeing in these films that it becomes almost disorienting when you really think about it. And also, just to underscore this point, so I was thinking about these issues about All About Eve, and I did the requisite Google search to see what others might have been saying. And in 2019, there were several articles about All About Eve, and one of them literally labels it the perfect feminist film. And the writer says that it could have been written today, which for me is just crazy. I couldn't disagree more strongly with that. And then someone else wrote an article saying, can we please, like revisit the politics of All About Eve and talk about what's going on here? So, I think this contradictory energy between these powerful women playing these parts versus what they're saying is playing out in the thought process around the film, which makes that even more fascinating. But ultimately, the film doesn't exist to be or not to be a feminist statement. It's a brilliantly written, directed, and acted movie. And Bette Davis, whose birthday we are celebrating, is it's hard to talk about how great she is in this film. I mean, just everything it needs to be and more. And, the true larger than life theatrical character and the grounded emotional vulnerability, fire. Just firing on all cylinders for this whole film, a must watch. Okay, getting back to the video. There's so many other Bette Davis movies to talk about. I'm sure I'll talk about more of them in the future, but these two are a great place to start for early career and then really mid-career, because she kept working into the late 70s and early 80s. She had a whole resurgence in the 60s with Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, the movie that Joan Crawford produced and they starred in together. And that led to a 60s resurgence, and then she worked in TV. So this was not All About Eve was not a late career movie. It was a kind of a mid-career movie, but it is really the towering achievement of her career. And just last little tidbit, she was not originally cast in the film. The film originally was supposed to star Claudette Colbert, and right before they started filming, Claudette Colbert hurt her back, and Bette Davis replaced her. So it almost might not have been, but it was. And we're so glad it was. And we celebrate Bette Davis. Happy birthday. If you've seen the movies, comment below. Tell me what your favorite Bette Davis movies are. Go watch these movies if you haven't seen them. And I will see you next Wednesday. Thanks for watching Real Takes. Hit the subscribe button below so the algorithms will tell you when new episodes are out. And if you want to support Real Takes, please visit my Patreon page where you can join at any tier from $2 to $100 per thing I make. The $15 tier is specifically about supporting Real Takes, and you'll get behind the scenes information and be thanked in future videos. See you next Wednesday.